In the next chapter on Sloterdijk, out of Sloterdijk's Spheres 1 Bubbles, it's called Excursus 2, Knobjects and Unrelationships on the Revision of Psychoanalytical Stage Theory. So now he begins moving down inside the womb and begins to, as it were, excavate it. He begins a sort of phenomenology of being in the cave of the womb in this chapter. And what he wants to do is revise psychoanalytical stage theory, the stage theory that there are, familiar from Freud with the oral phase, the genital phase, and so forth, that there are these developmental stages in the evolution of the early infancy. But the fallacy that is made, Sloterdijk believes, is to speak of these early stages in terms of a subject-object dichotomy, so that the mouth seeking the breast, or the anus and feces, or the genitals are all thought of in terms of objects. But this object-related theory presupposes that the child has fully formed itself as a subject. So, borrowing from Thomas Mako's idea of the knobject, the non-object, he wants to revise this developmental stage sequence into 3 pre-oral phases, all of which occur in or around the mother womb, the perinatal, to borrow Stanislav Grof's term, in or around the womb. And the first one of these oral stages that he talks about is that of the fetal cohabitation, in which the child experiences the knobjects, the object shadows, as it were, within the mother womb. And this includes things like the amniotic fluid and the umbilical cord and the placenta, and especially the placental blood. And he says here that these are all experienced as knobjects. And the reason, as he says, this is a negative gynecology is because a positive gynecology is concerned with an objective, distancing, scientific point of view, but a negative gynecology is a gynecology that is not objective but knobjective. It's concerned with knobjects, those things which cannot be experienced by the fetus or the early infant as objective, precisely because they're environmental. They're all surrounding. They're spheric and environmental, just as the fish, as McLuhan's famous proverb goes, cannot see the water that it's in. The water for the fish is a knobject. In the same way that the amniotic fluid of the fetus in the mother womb is an object. It's registered there as something that's there, but it can't be conceived of as an object in front of a subject. Rather, knobjects form the developmental stage, the proscenium, as it were, upon which subjects encounter objects. So it's developmental, it's medial and environmental. And one of the first knobjects that the fetus experiences in the mother womb is that, according to Sloterdijk, of the placental blood, which acts as a kind of trinitary or third thing that bonds the mother and child together in terms of a dyad. And so he says the blood, the experience of that blood, is very important as one of the first knobjects. It had been thought, there is an ancient theory that goes back to Aristotle, and it probably goes way back beyond Aristotle. James Hillman talks about this in his book, The Myth of Analysis, in which the reason it was traditionally thought that the woman stops menstruating when she is pregnant is because the menstrual blood is actually used during gestation to build and construct the new fetus. And consequently, when we look back at burial traditions through history, when we look at the fact that all the way back to the earliest burials in the Paleolithic, the burials are arranged in a fetal position with the legs drawn up and the dead body drawn tightly and bound up in itself in a fetal posture with red ochre sprinkled upon it. Neanderthals didn't use red ochre, but the Cro-Magnon peoples did, going back to about 100,000 BC in Palestine, where we find evidence for these earliest burials. It suggests that the red ochre may very possibly be a symbolic menstrual blood, as William Irwin Thompson points out in his book Coming into Being, that it's a symbolic menstrual blood that the corpse will need, as it were, for its next life to rebuild a brand new body and come back with a new somatic incarnation. The earliest evidence, by the way, in the previous chapter, Sloterdijk had talked about the cavern and the being in the world as being in the Great Mother as primordial and ancient. The very earliest evidence that we have that points toward burial comes from the Proto-Neanderthals, Homo heidelbergensis, who go back in Europe to about 400,000 years ago, at a cave that was found in Atapuerca in Spain, where apparently the Neanderthals were just tossing their dead into this hole in the ground. There was a cave, and inside the cave there was a giant hole in the ground full of dead Neanderthals of all ages. And so it doesn't look like a cave-in had taken place, but it looks as though it was used as the first primordial burying ground, and hence the analogy between womb and tomb goes all the way back here. But anyhow, the Neanderthals never used red ochre. It was an innovation of Cro-Magnon man, for whom the symbol verse seems to have been a creative explosion 30 or 40,000 years ago. All these new symbols come into being, and red ochre has been used for a long, long time, especially in connection with fetal-type burials. So the blood is very important, and that's what I want to highlight here in this footnote to Sloterdijk, is that the placental blood is very important as a sort of tertiary or third term that creates the biune dyad that bonds the mother and the infant together in this objective space inside the mother womb. And so this is the first of the three preoral stages that he talks about here, borrowing from Thomas Mako. The second of them, then, is the psychoacoustic aspect. Apparently, the fetus in the womb can hear things. Sonic vibrations are transmitted via the ether into vibratory excitations that the fetus can pick up on, and so it responds to sound, and it can hear sound very early. And sound itself has as Sloterdijk says, has an objective quality about it insofar as it does not exist in a material substrate so that it can be perceived as an object in front of an apprehending subject. It's pervasive and environmental and therefore not objective. And he says that in the postnatal experience, when the child is born and begins to develop its own voice, the voice becomes a kind of substitute for the umbilical cord. The umbilical cord that had acted to connect the child to the mother is substituted for by the voice, which connects the child to the mother sonically through their babblings between each other. The mother babbling to the infant, and the infant delightedly kicking its legs and squirming and responding back, creates a sonospheric umbilical cord, as it were, that the umbilical cord, Sloterdijk says here, functions kind of as an early telephone between of communication between mother and child in the womb. So we have the psychoacoustic aspect as the second of these preoral stages. The third of these preoral stages is actually postnatal, and it occurs when the child is born and it comes out into the world and it encounters another environment, namely air. So air is also non-objective in the sense that it's not something that can be perceived. It's something that you're swimming in like a fish in water. It's all-encompassing and environmental, and the child has to shift from a mode of respiring the amniotic fluid to respiring air. And so being in the world becomes, for us humans, being in the air as an environmental oxygenated envelope. In his later book, Terror from the Air, he will describe the beginnings of terrorist attacks in the 20th century, beginning with, in World War I, with the invention of chlorine nerve gas at the Battle of Ypres, with the Germans using it first against the French, using this chlorine gas to actually attack the air, to actually attack the non-objective airspace surrounding the individual. That became the first sort of terrorist attack and the prototype for all subsequent terrorist attacks, down to the Aum Shinrikyo nerve gas attacks that took place in Tokyo in 1994 or 5. So the air becomes a very important object. And so we have then this idea of a negative gynecology, which is not objective but non-objective, in the sense then that, as he had said in the previous chapter, his ideal observer is an observer that can be split into a dyad in which one individual is inside the womb, experiencing it phenomenologically, while the other half of the dyad or individual is on the outside in a sort of half-objective state, considering the vulva from the exterior. But the idea with the non-objective negative gynecology, in contradistinction to the positive gynecology, which sees things purely in terms of exteriors, purely in terms of subjects apprehending objects, the gynecologist apprehending the vulva, for example, is the non-objective nature of being on the inside and the outside simultaneously is what Sloterdijk wants to highlight and underline here. It's the idea of being inside and outside in a simultaneous sense, so that it's both and rather than either or. And he gives us an illustration of this. He draws from the ancient Chinese myth of the birth of Lao Tzu, and he says this is a little-known myth in the West that recounts the idea of Lao Tzu being a being who was both inside of his mother's womb and outside of it at the same time, in the sense that Lao Tzu spent supposedly 81 years in his mother's womb. And of course, 81 is simply 9 times 9. 9 months of gestation times 9 gives 81. He's in there for 81 months, and apparently the mother had conceived in a virgin birth. She had no husband through inhaling a dewdrop, and Lao Tzu was on the inside of her, but she was pregnant with him only in the daytime. And at night, Lao Tzu left her womb to go out and study the Tao. And as Sloterdijk says, he exchanged the tight, small womb cavern for the giant cavern of the macrospheric globe on the outside that he learns about through studying the Tao. And then in the daytime, he goes back into the mother womb, and then eventually he has to be born. And like Buddha, he's born from his mother's side, from her armpit, actually. And when he comes out of her, he's born on a day in which the gods have suspended the processes of birth and death so that they don't happen on the day that Lao Tzu is born. When he comes out of her, he's born as an old man with a grizzled old beard. And this surprises her to such an extent that it basically frightens her to death, and she dies. And then he goes to a tree, and he names himself Lao Tzu, which means old child. So notice then, too, though Sloterdijk doesn't remark this, that in China is the civilization that is the most opposed to the West in terms of its opposite reverence for the elders, as over against the wonder child. From the Greeks on, we have reverenced the wonder child as the one who brings us the miracle of the new gadget, the new invention. The child is the future, moving culture onward into change and progress and myths of progress that come out of this. Too, in this case, as in the film David Fincher's Curious Case of Benjamin Button, where the woman also gives birth to an old man, the Chinese have venerated the elders, and for them, the older a man is, the more wise he is likely to be, and the more conservative he is in being the one who conserves and guards the ancient founding archetypes of the culture, which cannot be disturbed, because if they're disturbed, then you mess up the culture. And so Lao Tzu, even as a child, is born as an old man. So that's as though the Chinese psyche were only willing to accept the idea of the wonder child as though it were in the guise or mode of an old man. So he uses this as a kind of mythical correlate for his ideal stance in his non-objective negative gynecology as being both inside the womb and outside it at the same time. Then he finishes this excursus by talking about R.D. Laing, who talks about being inside the womb and his excavations of prenatal memories. And some of this reminds me a little bit of Stanislav Grof, who has a theory in his holotropic breath work that a lot of what troubles the individual later on in life comes from the trauma of birth. And as Sloterdijk says, it's in the 20th century that birth, for the first time in history, becomes a trauma. It becomes, in the existential anxiety of being thrown onto the outside in the world, it's only in the 20th century that birth is now a problem. It's a trauma. It never would have occurred to the ancients as a problem in this sense. And so Stanislav Grof's study, where, like in the case of animal magnetism and hypnotism that we had talked about yesterday, what Grof had done was to develop holotropic breath work in which the individual, through rapid hyperventilating breathing, can regress and re-experience the birth trauma, and in doing so, process out a lot of the psychological blockages that come from the kind of no-exit feeling that the fetus has on the inside of the womb. R.D. Laing does something similar in this chapter here that Sloterdijk quotes from him, where he talks about the problems, a lot of problems of later life, Laing believed originally come from difficult experiences in the birth trauma, the experience of being actually conceived in there, and the idea of the egg being inserted in there, and he analogizes it, actually, the implantation of the egg into the mother womb, he analogizes it to the myth of the birth of the hero, the sort of the formation of the blastula and the sperm swimming up the uterine tube, as in the case of the birth of the hero, where the hero is put into a casket and swims down the river, is received by animal shepherds, just as the sperm is received by the egg, the ovum, and it has to endure these new circumstances in which it forfeits its autonomy and becomes taken care of and exists in a dreamlike state until the trauma of birth begins and the contractions begin and the rupture of our first sphere. Actually, our first spherological rupture then begins at the moment of birth. So this then is my analysis then of the excursus that comes after the chapter on the Great Mother, and there's another excursus after this on the egg, the principle of the egg, which is up next.